And it is great to see everyone, at least virtually, at the beginning of this new session. I keep thinking that we are just around the corner from gathering in person in the hearing room, and I had hoped by now we would be doing that, but Omicron has thrown a wrench into those hopes. So please, I hope everyone is staying safe, and I'm grateful that we can at least gather virtually while we keep working on the ability to get back together. Today, we'll discuss 9 pieces of legislation, all of which focus on conservation and protection of unique animals and ecosystems. All 9 of these bills, I should say 8 of the 9 bills, are bipartisan. So I'm glad to see that. One bill I'm especially pleased to discuss today is H.R. 4092. This is the Coastal Habitat Conservation Act of 2021. I'm leading this bill with my colleague, Congresswoman Gonzalez-Colon, and I'm thankful for the support of Senator Cardin and Senator Graham for sponsoring the Senate version of this bill. It would authorize the Fish and Wildlife Service's coastal program. This has helped coastal communities and their partners conserve and restore coastal ecosystems actually since 1985. These are partnerships that have benefited people, habitat, and wildlife in coastal areas along the Gulf of Mexico, Great Lakes, Caribbean, Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, including important areas in my district. One example, the North Coast Regional Land Trust, California Conservancy, Coastal Conservancy, and the Coastal Program worked together to restore a 35-acre wetland off Humboldt Bay in my district. And a recent study found that the salmon in Humboldt Bay grow 4 times faster in this watershed than others because the more mature salmon that have benefited from this habitat are better able to survive their journey out to the sea. So it's a great example of the work this program does. Coastal Program has completed nearly 5,000 projects like this nationwide, protecting more than 2.3 million acres of habitat and improving land and water for the people and wildlife that live there. My legislation will ensure that this important program continues to carry out projects that benefit all of us in coastal areas for many years to come. We will hear testimony on H.R. 3540 today, the Chesapeake Bay Science, Education, and Ecosystem Enhancement Act of 2021, led by Representative Sarbanes. Chesapeake Bay, of course, is the largest estuary in the country, home to 18 million Americans and a diverse array of fish and wildlife that have suffered from pollution, overfishing, and coastal development. This bill reauthorizes the NOAA Chesapeake Bay office to help study and restore this essential part of our landscape. Also authorizes funds for the Competitive Bay Watershed Education and Training Grants. We'll hear from Representative Tonko as he speaks to the importance of restoring the Hudson River estuary and its larger watershed. This is the most populous watershed in the United States. His bill, H.R. 4677, the New York, New Jersey Watershed Protection Act, would do a lot for this watershed. Toxic waste, PCBs, chronic flooding, and coastal development threaten endangered species and exacerbate environmental justice concerns there. The bill creates a watershed-wide restoration strategy and funds restoration work throughout the basin. Representative Dingell's bill, H.R. 5973, the Great Lakes Fish and Wildlife Restoration Reauthorization Act, reauthorizes funding for the Fish and Wildlife Service to continue work combating pollution, invasive species, and habitat degradation in the Great Lakes region. These hardships also affect clean water access for 35 million people that rely on this basin for potable water. Mr. Lowenthal's bill, H.R. 4057, the Albatross and Petrel Conservation Act, implements the agreement on the conservation of albatrosses and petrels. This is an international agreement protecting these birds from becoming victims of bycatch and improving their habitat in the U.S. and abroad. Representative Nadler's bill, H.R. 4716, the Refuge from Cruel Trapping Act, would prohibit body gripping traps within the National Wildlife Refuge System, except when used for government management and conservation purposes. Dozens of other countries and states have already done this. These traps are indiscriminate. They kill and wound endangered species and pets and have even injured children. They have no place in our wildlife refuges. Representative Costa's Multinational Species Conservation Fund's Semi-Postal Stamp Reauthorization Act, H.R. 6023, would direct the Postal Service to continue to sell all remaining Multinational Species Conservation Fund stamps. The proceeds from this stamp go toward the Multinational Species Fund, all of which All of this work helps conserve endangered species worldwide. H.R. 1546, the Combating Online Wildlife Trafficking Act, sponsored by Representative Buddy Carter, would amend the End Wildlife Trafficking Act to add internet and social media platforms to the federal anti-wildlife trafficking program. This will help us address the growing use of social media, such as Facebook, in wildlife trafficking. We held a hearing on this in April of last year, and I'm grateful to see this bill. Lastly, we have a bill by Representative Dan Newhouse, which seeks to recognize and celebrate the 75th anniversary of the National Association of Conservation Districts. Conservation districts began in the 1930s to improve soil and water conditions at the behest of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Today, there are nearly 3,000 of these districts across the United States. So I'm eager to hear from our colleagues about their bills. I look forward to the invaluable testimony of our invited witnesses. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ranking Member Benz for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I welcome members and witnesses to today's hearing. We are considering 8 bills and 1 resolution, many of which reauthorize current or create new programs within the Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. While it's clear that the majority wants to hear testimony, however limited, on these Democrat-sponsored bills, it's of course disappointing we couldn't have a robust discussion on additional Republican bills. To that point, not included in this hearing are any common sense ESA bills such as H.R. 6019, the Northern Spotted Owl Habitat Improvement Act, which I introduced. This bill would codify the Trump administration's Northern Spotted Owl Critical Habitat revision, which would fine-tune the owl's habitat designation and remove about 1 million acres from the numerous millions of acres of habitat lands designated as owl habitat. This was just one of 7 Republican bills my staff provided as potential bills for today's hearing. The substance of the hearing, or to address it, out of the 7 Republican bills, we were given Mr. Carter's bill, H.R. 1546, which reauthorizes the Presidential Task Force on Wildlife Trafficking. In addition, the bill requires the task force to develop recommendations and establish a working group to address wildlife trafficking on the internet. Last year, we had an oversight hearing on this issue, and clearly improvements can be made. I will briefly review the list of remaining bills. H.R. 3540 by Mr. Sarbanes reauthorizes NOAA's Chesapeake Bay office, which hasn't been reauthorized since 2006. I will note that the bill's authorization levels, which start at 17 million and increase annually, are more than double current authorization levels. According to NOAA, in fiscal year 2021, the Chesapeake Bay office received about 8.1 million. That's quite a jump, but unfortunately NOAA is not testifying at this hearing. H.R. 4057 by Mr. Lowenthal would implement the Agreement on the Conservation of Albatrosses and Petrels. The United States Senate has not ratified this agreement, yet it seems the House is skipping that constitutional requirement. H.R. 4092 by Mr. Huffman legislatively authorizes a program the Fish and Wildlife Service administratively created and has been running since 1984, begging the question of why an authorization is necessary after all this time. H.R. 4677 by Mr. Tonko creates a program specifically for what it defines as the New York-New Jersey Watershed. It appears this bill is drafted to replicate the framework of the Delaware River Basin Conservation Act. H.R. 4716 by Mr. Nadler would ban the possession or use of body gripping traps in the National Wildlife Refuge System. While there are some exemptions or exceptions to this ban, there are serious concerns with the impact this bill will have on the management of those refuges and the creatures within them. This proposal has met prior opposition and concerns from the Fish and Wildlife Service, state and fish and wildlife agencies, and the sportsman's community. H.R. 5973 by Ms. Dingell reauthorizes the Great Lakes Fish and Wildlife Restoration Act by 5 years. The Fish and Wildlife Service owes this committee its latest report on the implementation of this law. Even worse, we have received no timeline as to when that late report will be released. H.R. 6023 by Mr. Costa requires the United States Postal Service to sell the Multinational Species Conservation Fund semi-postal stamp. And lastly, Resolution 641, House Resolution 641 by Mr. Newhouse is a resolution recognizing the 75th anniversary of the National Association of Conservation Districts, which have helped landowners in rural America for generations. I commend Mr. Newhouse on his effort. I look forward to our panels of today's witnesses and to finding out more about these bills. I thank our colleagues for their leadership, and I look forward to working with them on their efforts. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back the remainder of my time.
I thank the ranking member, and just for the record, we are always happy to include Republican-led bills that are good faith efforts to address conservation and climate issues under our jurisdiction. Unfortunately, the bills that were recommended by Republican staff were deeply problematic and controversial, including, unfortunately, very familiar attempts to undermine the Endangered Species Act. These are not bills that are going to pass the Congress, and they are not going to get hearings as well. But we are happy to introduce Representative Carter's and Newhouse's bills in this hearing, and I will just extend an open invitation to our Republican colleagues. If you've got good ideas to actually advance conservation, protect the environment, do good things within our jurisdiction, you're going to find that your bill sails through and has broad support. So I will once again extend that invitation and hope that we see more of that. I understand that the full committee ranking member, Mr. Westerman, is here. So Mr. Westerman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman and Ranking Member Bentz, for holding this hearing today. Today's legislative hearing, as we've already heard, includes 8 bills and a House resolution. And although Republicans would like to see more of our bills on the agenda, more of our science-based, forward-looking bills that are good for the country, we would like to see these on the agenda. And we'll keep making requests to get them on there. I do want to congratulate Mr. Carter of Georgia and Mr. Newhouse of Washington State for their leadership on 2 of the initiatives before us. Mr. Carter's bill renews the Federal Wildlife Trafficking Task Force and modernizes it by requiring the task force to examine the role of the internet on wildlife trafficking. Mr. Newhouse's resolution commemorates the 75th anniversary of the National Association of Conservation Districts, which have played an important role in cooperative land and water conservation throughout America. There are 6 additional legislative measures before us, and I look forward to hearing more about them. And speaking of controversial, non-scientific, bad bills, I would like to focus on one bill in particular. H.R. 4716, introduced by Mr. Nadler of New York City and co-sponsored by 46 of his Democrat colleagues, bans most legal trapping activities on our national wildlife refuges. This bill is way out there, and if we were going to use an acid test to see what bills should come before the committee based on science and what's good for conservation, I don't think this one would have made it through. According to the Fish and Wildlife website, the agency uses trapping as a, quote, cost-effective method that helps protect endangered species and migratory birds, restore species in decline, prevent and reduce property damage, and control destructive invasive species, unquote. The agency also views trapping as a legitimate recreational and economic activity when there are harvestable surpluses of fur-bearing animals. Trapping is allowed on 240 national wildlife refuges in 46 states, including 10 refuges in my home state of Arkansas, 4 of which are in my district. If trapping isn't allowed on these wildlife refuges, waterfowl habitat and other infrastructure would simply disappear thanks to the destructive behavior of beavers. Now, if you grew up in New York City and haven't been around a beaver, you might not know that they're like the world's first engineer. They're very, very effective at what they do. And the beaver is concerned about his habitat. And if it's to his advantage to drain an impoundment, he will drain the impoundment. He'll open up drainage systems and drain water from one area to another area. If it's his advantage to make an impoundment, he'll build a dam and make an impoundment. Beavers sometimes like to build impoundments and kill timber. Species that are not tolerant to flood conditions, beavers can build dams and kill that timber and make their own habitat. This is very detrimental to other species. And, just arbitrarily saying we're going to stop trapping without having some kind of control measure to keep these species in balance would actually do great harm to other species. So It's no surprise that the federal agency witnesses here today have concerns about this one-size-fits-all bill. The witnesses here representing the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, Mr. Gordon Batchelor, has similar concerns that the bill overrides scientific management, state supervised game and fish activities, and Native American treaty rights, and is very overburdensome. As does the Sportsman's Alliance and other similar groups dedicated to outdoor recreation, which see the trapping ban in this bill as a first step in eliminating hunting on national wildlife refuges. I understand that this bill has been modified since the last Congress, but it still has major problems. Suffice to say, I strongly oppose this controversial bill as currently written and would say that folks living in New York City shouldn't be trying to dictate how we manage our waterfowl habitat in Arkansas, but that's exactly what this bill does. I commend the members and witnesses here today and look forward to hearing and examining these bills with the hope that future hearings have more Republican bills on the agenda. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Arkansas, the ranking member. Our first panel is going to be a congressional panel for members to speak on their bills that are on the agenda today. Obviously, the votes complicated our schedule, and so we're going to shuffle the order a little bit. Mr. Lowenthal has to chair a subcommittee meeting very shortly, and so we're going to hear from him first. So, Mr. Lowenthal, you are recognized to speak to H.R. 4057.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Huffman, and Ranking Member Bentz for holding today's hearing and for including the Albatross and Petrel Conservation Act on the agenda. I'm pleased and proud to co-lead this bipartisan legislation with my friend and colleague, Representative Brian Fitzpatrick. This bill authorizes the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service to promulgate regulations to implement and enforce the agreement on the conservation of albatrosses and petrels. This agreement is a treaty which coordinates conservation efforts for threatened and endangered albatross and petrel species, and currently has 13 countries as party to the agreement. The agreement requires that measures be taken by signatory governments to reduce bycatch, protect breeding colonies, and control and remove introduced species from breeding sites, especially on islands. Support for this agreement has enjoyed bipartisan support from both Republican and Democratic administrations. For example, in his transmittal letter to Congress, President George W. Bush stated that, and I quote, "I believe the agreement to be fully in the U.S. interest." He continues, "The agreement, though, is not self-executing and thus does not in itself give rise to domestically enforceable federal laws. Implementing legislation would be required." This bill is that required implementation legislation. It is needed now more than ever. Albatrosses and petrels are among the world's most endangered species of migratory seabirds. At the last advisory committee, which is the committee made up of those 13 countries that have ratified the agreement, the state of these species was described, that's the albatrosses and petrel, as urgent and a continuing conservation crisis. While many countries have taken steps to protect albatrosses and petrels due to their long migratory ranges, they still face numerous threats from fishing gear, invasive species, disease, land use changes, and disturbances in nesting sites. This bill will not only protect albatrosses and petrels, but will create equity for our fisheries. Under this legislation, domestic fisheries would not be subject to any additional restrictions on their activities. The United States is currently a world leader on seabird bycatch mitigation, and this legislation would allow the U.S. to promote more stringent international regulations to level the playing field between domestic fisheries and international fisheries. By passing this legislation, we give the Senate the implementation legislation that would be required with ratification of the agreement anyway, as well as protecting these threatened seabirds, and gives the U.S. the ability to leverage greater competition for our own fisheries internationally. Thank you again, Mr. Chair and Mr. Ranking Member, and I look forward to participating more in today's hearing. Finally, I'd like to submit for the record letters of support for the Albatross and Petrel Conservation Act from the American Bird Conservancy, Defenders of Wildlife, the National Audubon Society, the National Wildlife Federation, the Ocean Conservancy, the World Wildlife Fund, and the Pacific Seabird Group. Thank you, and I yield back.
Without objection, those letters will be entered into the record. Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal. The chair now recognizes Mr. Costa for 5 minutes to speak on HR 6023, the Multinational Species Conservation Fund's Semi-Postal Stamp Reauthorization Act.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Benz. Chairman Huffman, I think you put together a good package of legislation for the subcommittee to consider, and I'd like to present a brief summary of HR 6023, which would reauthorize the multinational species conservation funds, utilizing the semi-postal stamp, also known as the Tiger stamp, which has been very popular, until the Postal Service sells all remaining copies. And of course, we've used this methodology in the past to support important, worthwhile efforts as a way of raising necessary funds. This measure has the support of the Wildlife Conservation Society, the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, World Wildlife Fund, Humane Society, and other international funds for animal welfare. It was first introduced in 2011. Over 55 million stamps were sold. They raised over $6 million for conservation at no additional cost to the taxpayer, important to note. The Tiger stamp cost just a little more than a regular first-class stamp, with the additional proceeds equally distributed among the multinational species conservation funds, which support international conservation efforts for iconic species such as tigers, rhinoceroses, elephants, marine turtles, and various species of apes. Selling the stamp is also relatively easy. They're popular. It's inexpensive, and it's a voluntary way to raise funds and awareness about conservation and international species. The initial funding raised by stamp sales has contributed to over 100 conservation projects in 35 countries. That's important. The Multinational Species Conservation Fund leverages up to three non-federal dollars for every dollar invested. The Postal Service stopped selling the Tiger stamp in 2019, citing the lack of congressional reauthorization. Congress has since included language in the annual appropriation bills requiring that the USPS to continue selling Tiger stamps. Approximately 45 million stamps remain unsold, which generate millions of additional dollars to help conserve some of the world's most iconic species. This bill is needed to reauthorize the sale of the Tiger stamp, directing the United States Postal Service to sell the stamp until all remaining copies are sold. And I would suggest that we maybe consider amending it to go beyond that. We have colleagues of ours on both sides of the aisle. On the Republican side, Katko and Congressman Katko and Congressman Young are co-sponsoring this legislation, and on the Senate, Senator Portman, as well as Senator Carper. So that, in my summary, is the legislation, and I hope we can move forward in a bipartisan way. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to respond. If you have any other good suggestions, I would also certainly like to take those into account.
Thank you very much, Mr. Costa. I appreciate your work on this. And the chair will now recognize Mr. Tonko to, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Jim. Were you?
I have to go to. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So Congressman Paul Tonko is going to speak to his bill, HR 4677, on the beautiful Hudson River watershed. You recognize Mr. Tonko.
Thank you. I thank you, Chairman Huffman and Ranking Member Bentz, for the opportunity to address the subcommittee and for including my bill, HR 4677, the New York, New Jersey Watershed Protection Act, in today's important hearing. Our watershed includes 6 major rivers across our 2 states, their tributaries and estuaries, and the numerous communities that these waterways have shaped for centuries. New York's 20th Congressional District, situated at the confluence of the mighty Hudson and historic Mohawk rivers, is blessed to be a part of this great watershed. Centuries ago, these waters powered our mills, carried goods from the coast to the rest of the nation, and inspired the growth of a necklace of mill towns, including my hometown of Amsterdam. Today, the watershed is the nation's most populous, home to more than 15 million people. Millions more visit each year, supporting a multi-billion-dollar recreation and tourism industry. These vital water resources also serve as sources of drinking water for millions of people and provide habitats for more than 200 fish species and several endangered and threatened species. However, our industrial heritage poses unique threats to our cherished communities and ecosystems. Many mills have since closed their doors. Hazardous waste and legacy chemicals, including PCBs, from the factories that built our economy years ago, remain unacceptably high, threatening the health and safety of ecosystems, wildlife, and human health throughout the entire watershed. The metropolitan area includes more than 500 miles of coastline, yet due to pollution and mismanagement, only a scant few of those miles are available for access and recreation, and even fewer in communities experiencing environmental injustice. Our communities are already witnessing the devastation of sea level rise, increasing storm surges and flood risks, all made more severe by the growing effects of climate change. The extreme floods that endangered families and communities over the past year were indeed tragic and should compel us to rethink our connection to the waters of our region. I have always believed that the power of our waters can be harnessed once again to transform the region in the 21st century. We can build an economy today that uses our mighty waters not as sources of harm and pollution to local communities, but for enhanced public health, cherished gathering places, public outreach and education, and the celebration of a heritage that grounds us in our deep roots while propelling us into a cleaner and more just future. Our waterways are the key to that future, one filled with smart development, innovation, and new jobs, if we respect and care for them. My bipartisan New York, New Jersey Watershed Protection Act will turn the tide for these waters by establishing a targeted role for the federal government in the implementation of a holistic, basin-wide strategy to coordinate local restoration projects that promote healthy ecosystems and improve coastal resilience, water quality, and public engagement. This collaborative model to help the watershed addresses its greatest challenges and will encourage collaboration amongst key partners, build on state and local efforts, and leverage private dollars. Our watershed is America's most crowded, and it has had nationally significant cultural, ecological, and economic impacts on our nation for centuries. Managing this public resource and its many services requires leadership and collaboration from all levels of government. Yet every other watershed that supports a population of this size has received significantly more federal investment. The Delaware and other regional watershed programs have been hugely successful and have woven their models into this legislation. Our watershed must be considered alongside our nation's most significant water bodies and receive the same federal support so that it can remain a critical natural resource and national economic engine for generations to come. I am proud that this legislation is supported by 26 bipartisan members from around the watershed, and I would like to thank my partners in the Senate who recently introduced companion legislation. We have also received letters of support from state agencies, local governments, and more than 50 local organizations whose meaningful restoration plans can finally be implemented with the support and coordination offered by this legislation. I would like to request to submit these letters into the record, Mr. Chair.
Without objection.
Thank you. This long overdue effort to manage the vital water resources that bind together the communities, economies, and heritage of the region would launch a new chapter of prosperity and equity for the New York, New Jersey watershed and deliver untold benefits in conservation, ecosystem health, human health, and community development. Once again, I thank the chair and the members of the subcommittee for holding this vital hearing today and for including our legislation. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tonko. The chair now recognizes Representative John Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, I understand you have a little estuary that you would like to protect as well.
Thank you very much, Chairman Huffman and Ranking Member Benz, members of the subcommittee, for this invitation to testify. We move from discussion of one watershed to discussion of another watershed. I'm here to speak in support of my bill, HR 3540, the Chesapeake Bay Science, Education, and Ecosystem Enhancement Act of 2021, which previously actually had passed the House with bipartisan support. This bill would reauthorize NOAA's Chesapeake Bay office and authorize the agency's Successful Bay Watershed Education and Training, or BWET, grant program. As our nation's largest estuary, the Chesapeake Bay is in many ways the soul of Maryland. This national environmental treasure also impacts residents throughout its expansive watershed, which includes Delaware, the District of Columbia, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and West Virginia, and is an economic engine for the region's tourism and seafood industries. Unfortunately, locally produced nutrient runoff, rising sea levels due to climate change, the loss of coastal and marine habitat, and other factors have negatively impacted the bay's health over time. As the coordinating body for research and restoration efforts in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, NOAA's Chesapeake Bay office plays a major role in improving bay health by providing vital scientific research and data for these efforts and engaging in habitat restoration projects and environmental education. Despite these endeavors, the office has not been reauthorized by Congress since 2006, although Congress has continued to appropriate funds annually for its operation. The Chesapeake Bay Sea Act would finally reauthorize this critical office so that we can better protect and restore the national treasure that is the Chesapeake Bay. It would do this in a few ways. First, simply reauthorizing the office will ensure that it remains the hub of all the bay-related programs and activities undertaken at NOAA, strengthening collaboration across those programs and ultimately allowing the agency to more efficiently further its coastal resource stewardship mission. This bill would also enhance the Chesapeake Bay interpretive buoy system, which provides real-time weather and environmental information, collecting meteorological, oceanographic, and water quality data and wirelessly relaying it for use by researchers, boaters, educators, and the public. The bill would also, for the first time, statutorily authorize the BWET program, which provides valuable hands-on environmental education to teach young people how their everyday actions affect the Bay, and it would centralize the administration of this program within the Bay office. Finally, the Chesapeake Bay Sea Act would also expand NOAA's aquaculture technical assistance programs, which help in the restoration of living resources such as oysters in the Bay. Not only is this assistance vital for environmental protection, but it is also critical to supporting the seafood industry, which provides tens of thousands of jobs and is an economic driver of the region. Through federal, state, and local partner cooperation, we have made great progress to restore and protect the health of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. The NOAA Chesapeake Bay office has been an essential partner in this endeavor, and this bill will ensure that it remains ready and able to develop and carry out its important work for the region. The Chesapeake Bay has long benefited from bipartisan support, and I hope that bipartisan legacy will continue today with the support for HR 3540. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your interest in the Bay. I remember we did that field hearing
Yes.
in Baltimore, and with that, I yield back.
Beautiful, beautiful place, Chesapeake Bay. Thanks for your leadership. So the chair next recognizes Congressman Dan Newhouse to tell us about HRES 641. Mr. Newhouse, I wonder if that statue in the background there has something to do with our Conservation District's 75th anniversary, or?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would like to pull a direct connection there, but it's for Mr. Bentz's benefit. That's Dr. McLaughlin behind me from the great state of Oregon.
Well, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is just a place that we were able to find a quiet corner in the building, so.
Nice.
Well, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, thank you for this opportunity to come before the committee today to testify on behalf of House Resolution 641, my resolution celebrating the 75th anniversary of the National Association of Conservation Districts and their commitment to our lands. The National Association of Conservation Districts, or the NACD, is an organization that works with local conservation districts, land managers, and communities to promote partnerships, increase education, and support locally led and voluntary conservation of our natural resources around the country. On August 4th, 1937, President Franklin D. Roosevelt established the first conservation district in North Carolina. Today, there are nearly 3,000 conservation districts, almost one in every county in every state, plus the U.S. territories, who work directly with landowners to conserve and restore healthy soils, water, forests, and wildlife. NACD represents these districts and the more than 17,000 citizens who serve on their local governing boards. And in 2021, I'm happy to say they celebrated their 75th anniversary. NACD was founded on the philosophy that conservation decisions should be made at the local level, and that we should all strive to advocate for common sense policy reforms that empower those that are closest to the land, not bog them down with unnecessary or overburdensome regulations. So as a third-generation farmer from the state of Washington and chairman of the Congressional Western Caucus, I've seen firsthand how communities have been negatively impacted by decades of federal overreach, inaction, or land mismanagement. Now the entire country is witnessing the effects in real time. Things such as catastrophic wildfires, which, Mr. Chairman, in your state have been devastating, that are destroying our homes, our businesses, and landscapes across the West. Water shortages, damaged crops, and dying livestock resulting from historic drought conditions and a less than 3% federal success rate, unfortunately, for our species recovery efforts. That's why I'm here today to applaud the NACD for their work to strengthen effective, locally led, and voluntary conservation efforts, and why I was proud to introduce this bipartisan resolution in support of their anniversary alongside my friends, Ranking Member Westerman, Representative Don Bacon, and Representative Sanford Bishop. States, local governments, and tribal partners have consistently proven themselves as the best stewards of their unique landscapes, and we cannot continue to implement a one-size-fits-all approach at the expense of our rural communities. If we truly are serious about protecting our resources, and I know all of us are, we should be promoting the work of NACD and conservation districts across the country who are truly leading the way toward clean water, clean air, and healthy landscapes by working with these partners literally on the ground. I've been fortunate to work firsthand with local conservation districts in my community, and I hope all of you have had the same opportunity. I'm very proud to point out the fact that Mr. Michael Crowder, the current president of NACD, is from the great state of Washington. For years, he personally has focused on wetland restoration, on wildlife science and ecology, all while managing the family's third-generation farm. He has won several awards for his work and dedication to natural resource conservation. He's not only a constituent of mine and a friend, but he's one of the strongest and most passionate advocates for effective stewardship of natural resources and wildlife, a true leader for hunting, agriculture, and conservation. And I truly applaud his leadership at NACD as an advocate for common sense conservation efforts throughout Washington and across the country. So, Mr. Chairman, I have a letter here from NACD written by Mr. Crowder that I'd like to submit for the record, thanking the committee for taking up this resolution today.
Without objection.
Thank you. This bipartisan resolution indicates Congress's strong support for NACDs, their continued mission, and a commitment to lifting up the efforts of local districts and conservation through the communities we represent. I'm proud to be joined by 33 of my colleagues in recognizing NACD and the amazing work that they do to promote responsible land management. And I look forward to the work that they will do in the next 75 years. Thank you again, Chairman Huffman and Ranking Member Bentz, for inviting me to speak today. And I look forward to working with you, with all of you, as we look for solutions that leverage local expertise, creative and effective tools, and dedicated partners that achieve well-balanced, tangible conservation outcomes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Newhouse, for this resolution. And I want to now recognize Congresswoman Debbie Dingell. Representative Dingell's been very patient in waiting to tell us about HR 5973, the Great Lakes Fish and Wildlife Restoration Reauthorization Act. So thank you for that. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman and Ranking Member Bentz, for convening today's legislative hearing on a number of really good bills aimed at protecting our wildlife habitats and restoring important natural resources nationwide, including the Great Lakes. As someone who spent her life growing up on these great waters and has the privilege of representing Michigan in Congress, as well as serving as co-chair of the Great Lakes Task Force, we must continue to prioritize and protect the economic and environmental health of the Great Lakes. These waters, Lake Huron, Lake Ontario, Lake Michigan, Lake Erie, and Lake Superior, serve as the economic, ecological, and cultural backbone of our 8-state, 2-province region. They comprise the world's largest surface freshwater system, holding nearly 21% of the total global supply of fresh water in the world, and 90% of the United States freshwater supply. They are the source of drinking water for over 30 million Americans. And the lakes are also an economic driver that supports jobs, commerce, agriculture, transportation, and tourism for millions of Americans across this country, millions of people across this country. Before the subcommittee today is important legislation that I am proud to sponsor with some of my other Midwest partners that will continue important work to protect and preserve the Great Lakes ecosystem. I appreciate the committee's inclusion of HR 5973, the Great Lakes Fish and Wildlife Restoration Reauthorization Act, bipartisan legislation I'm leading with my colleagues, Congressman Darren LaHood from Illinois, Congressman Paul Tonko of New York, and David Joyce of Ohio. In fiscal year 2021, the authorization of this law expired. Without a swift reauthorization, future conservation efforts carried out under this important program face uncertainty, or even worse, are in jeopardy of not being carried out at all. And this will hinder our ability to combat threats from invasive species, as well as to adapt to the impacts of climate change, which are very real. And this is why it is so critical to authorize this without delay. This legislation simply reauthorizes funding for the Great Lakes Fish and Wildlife Restoration Act for 5 years, from fiscal years 2022 through 2027 at the current funding levels. But it's also much more than that. It reauthorizes the Fish and Wildlife Service field offices across the Great Lakes Basin, which are in key positions that are necessary to liaison with state and local partners. It reauthorizes important research and restoration projects, and it reauthorizes the thorough selection process established for selecting the best projects that will serve the long-term interests of the Great Lakes Basin. This is one of the places that you have seen bipartisan congressional support for protecting the Great Lakes Basin, including reauthorization of this law. Since its inception in 1990, it's been reauthorized 3 times, most recently in 2016. Quite frankly, it was one of the first bills I led when I got to the Congress. Over the last 3 decades, the Fish and Wildlife Service, in partnership with academic institutions, state and local natural resource departments, tribal authorities, and nonprofit conservation partners have made meaningful process improvements and demonstrated the program's great success across the region. One of the true strengths of this program is how well it fosters collaborative private-public partnerships that leverage the American taxpayer dollar to make landscape-level improvements to our fish and wildlife habitats. Since 1998, the Act has provided federal funding to 148 research and restoration projects. A good process proves, if you have a good process, it goes a long way. I'll give you an example of a successful project which was completed in my district in 2020 when the Fish and Wildlife Service and Ducks Unlimited partnered with the University of Michigan's Botanical Gardens to improve 8 acres of rare wetlands using a variety of invasive species control tactics. The ecological integrity of this site was maintained as a result of this conservation investment. To close, this legislation has broad bipartisan support, as well as the backing of a variety of groups dedicated to protecting the Great Lakes, including Ducks Unlimited and the Great Lakes Fishery Committee. I want to thank my colleagues again, and we have Senator Klobuchar and Portman, and we look forward to working with you in a strong bipartisan manner to get this bill reauthorized. I urge all of my colleagues to support it and yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Dingell. Last but certainly not least, since I understand Congressman Nadler is not going to be able to be with us, we go to the great state of Georgia and Buddy Carter to tell us about HR 1546. Mr. Carter, good to see you. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. And first of all, let me thank the committee. Thank the committee for the opportunity to speak in support of a bill which I introduced and is now under consideration before this committee. HR 1546, the Combating Wildlife Trafficking Act. It's a critically important bill to the protection of endangered and threatened species across the globe. While this bill is before the Natural Resources Committee, the origins of this bill came from my work in the Energy and Commerce Committee. During my time on Energy and Commerce, we had spent a good deal of time focusing on big tech, especially social media sites and their effects on our lives. For all the good that these platforms have brought to our lives, they have also facilitated crimes and other harmful actions throughout our society. From drug deals to human trafficking, the internet is a new front to fight some of the worst crimes we know. This bill before you today would target one of those most tragic crimes, the trafficking of wildlife, especially endangered and threatening species. This is an issue close to my heart. I grew up a sportsman and loving the outdoors. Some of my fondest memories are fishing on the Georgia coast with my dad. I know how important it is to conserve and protect the natural resources and species around the world. These are treasures I want my grandchildren and their grandchildren to enjoy as I did. My bill builds upon the successful Eliminate, Neutralize, and Disrupt Wildlife Trafficking Act of 2016 by reauthorizing the Presidential Task Force on Wildlife Trafficking. However, it includes the important new mandate that the task force address wildlife trafficking online. To provide some background, in July 2013, President Barack Obama issued Executive Order 13648, which established a Presidential Task Force on Wildlife Trafficking, co-chaired by the Secretary of State, the Secretary of the Interior, and the Attorney General. Through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, it investigates wildlife crimes, enforces wildlife laws, regulates wildlife trade, and works in partnership with the international, state, and tribal counterparts to conserve wildlife resources. Later in 2016, the task force was codified into law and is required to submit an annual report that includes updates on the national strategy for combating wildlife trafficking and identifies countries with significant levels of wildlife trafficking. The law included a sunset provision which terminated the statutory authority of the task force on October 7th of 2021. My bill reauthorizes the task force through October 7th of 2026. As I mentioned before, the bill requires the task force to develop recommendations and establish a working group to address wildlife trafficking on the internet. The Department of State and the U.S. Agency for International Development are also required to develop a strategy for engaging with internet and social media companies to address wildlife trafficking on their platforms. We've made great strides to combat wildlife trafficking, but it is essential that we expand these efforts to stop trafficking facilitated all too easily by the internet. I would like to thank Representative John Garamiti from California for being the Democrat lead on this important bill. I also want to thank the subcommittee for considering the bill at today's hearing. It's been introduced last Congress, but did not receive a hearing, so I'm pleased that we can bring much needed attention to this issue. I believe this is common sense and bipartisan bill that will go a long way in combating wildlife trafficking in the 21st century. I want to thank the subcommittee again for allowing me the opportunity to speak on this bill, and I hope you will soon report it favorably so we may further preserve species around the globe. As I said, Mr. Chairman, this is a very important bill, something that I take very seriously. I do appreciate the indulgence of the committee. I appreciate your consideration, and I hope that the bill will move forward. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carter. And I want to thank all the sponsors of bills that we're considering today for their testimony and their leadership. We'll now transition to our second panel and hear testimony from the administration witness. Under committee rules, we ask the witness to limit the oral testimony to 5 minutes, but the entire statement from the witness will appear in the hearing record. And I believe that Mr. Girton knows this. When you begin speaking, the timer will start counting down. It'll turn orange when you have 1 minute and red when your time is up. I recommend to members and witnesses who are joining remotely to use the grid view so that they can lock the timer on their screen. After the testimony is complete, I ask our witness to please remember to mute yourself to avoid background noise, and we will then bring it back to the members for questions. So our administration witness today is Mr. Stephen Girton, Deputy Director for Policy at the Fish and Wildlife Service. The chair now recognizes Mr. Girton for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bentz, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Steve Girton, Deputy Director for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We collaborate with partners across the country and around the globe to fulfill our mission of working with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, and plants and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on 7 fish and wildlife conservation bills. The service supports H.R. 4057, the Albatross and Petrel Conservation Act, which would implement the multilateral agreement to conserve these far-ranging seabirds. We welcome the opportunity to work with the committee to ensure that the legislation is consistent with existing statutes. We have responsibilities for albatrosses and petrels under authorities like the MBTA and the Endangered Species Act. Many populations spend time on national wildlife refuges and monuments. We conserve them through habitat conservation, invasive species management, and enforcement of take prohibitions. International coordination is needed to better conserve these highly migratory and periled species. The agreement coordinates the efforts of several countries, and the bill enables the U.S. to leverage our existing conservation activities. We also support H.R. 4092, the Coastal Habitat Conservation Act, which would codify our successful program. The program provides technical and financial assistance to states, tribes, coastal communities, and many partners to conserve fish and wildlife habitat on public and private lands. The program leverages partner contributions, increasing the positive impact of every taxpayer dollar. Coastal program projects build resilience to the impacts of climate change and conserve federal trust species, and they provide lasting benefits by employing contractors, restoring coastal wetlands, supporting fisheries, and increasing opportunities for hunting and fishing. H.R. 4677 would establish the New York, New Jersey Watershed Restoration Program. The service has a long history of working collaboratively with partners to conserve lands and waters in the watershed for the benefit of people and wildlife. This bill would enhance this work, facilitating a collaborative landscape scale conservation effort to tackle complex environmental challenges. We appreciate the sponsor's interest in ensuring that trapping practices on refuge lands are humane. Trapping is an important tool that the service uses to protect threatened and endangered species, migratory birds, and infrastructure investments. We appreciate that the legislation would maintain flexibility to employ trapping to carry out conservation and management objectives on refuges, and we welcome the opportunity to suggest related changes to the legislation. The service supports H.R. 5973, which would reauthorize the Great Lakes Fish and Wildlife Restoration Act. This partner-led grant program under the Act has a hugely successful track record of restoring and managing fish and wildlife resources and their habitats in the Great Lakes Basin, providing $32 million in federal funding over the last few years to over 193 projects. We've worked with more than 100 organizations who have also contributed some 15 million in matching funds. We support HR 6023, which would reauthorize the so-called tiger stamp. This semi-postal stamp provides a unique opportunity for the American public to directly support the conservation of iconic wildlife species across the globe. Sales of the tiger stamp generate significant non-appropriated resources for the multinational species conservation funds, enabling us to achieve a greater conservation impact for some of the world's most imperiled species and their habitats. We also support HR 1546, the Combating Online Wildlife Trafficking Act, which helps address the serious global threat posed by wildlife trafficking. We testified just last April on the subject, and since then, we're still seeing significant illegal trade online. We continue our work to address online trafficking, including our work with the Department of Justice to engage the private sector, and we welcome the opportunity to continue working with leadership on the committee to identify a more direct role for the service in this legislation. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify on these important bills. We appreciate your continued efforts to advance our nation's ability to conserve, restore, and protect our natural resources for generations to come. And we'd be happy to answer any questions for the committee at this time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gerten. I'll note that NOAA has submitted a statement supporting HR 3540 and HR 4057. I'd like to submit that statement to the record, and hearing no objection, it is so ordered. And I will remind members that as we turn now to their questions of Mr. Gerten, the committee rules impose a 5-minute limit on those questions. I'll start by recognizing myself, and Mr. Gerten, thank you for your testimony. During our April 2021 hearing, you alluded to this. We did discuss the significant role that Facebook plays in facilitating online wildlife trafficking, and you caught my interest by referencing work you are doing with the Department of Justice to try to confront that problem. Can you tell us a little bit more about what your agency is doing in that regard?
Sure, and I'm very pleased to provide an update to the committee. We talked about 10 months ago about an issue we had with Facebook. We were able to work with them. We provided them specific information, and they did take the information off of their platform. That was a good first start, forging a partnership with that organization. We've also been working with another pay-for-platform this past few months. This is an ongoing issue. We've identified some problematic material on their platform, and they're working with us to take that down. Unfortunately, a lot of the private partners that we work with, we still need to approach them and sometimes give them a subpoena to get them to work with us. And so we're continuing to do more of a proactive stance, building these relationships, explaining the importance of their role in combating wildlife trafficking, and enlisting their help to take this business offline and help us all reach our common objective of wildlife conservation.
Yeah, I don't mean to suggest Facebook is the only vector for this kind of trafficking, but in April at our hearing, we did hear that Facebook certainly was the platform of choice for those who are engaging in this. And so let me just ask if you believe Facebook remains a leading facilitator of online wildlife trafficking.
We're still seeing a lot of stuff on their platform there, sir, among many other of the private sector groups. And to their credit, they have worked with us on this one case, but we think we can do a lot more with their organization.
All right. But to your knowledge, are other platforms part of the problem as well?
Yes, certainly, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Any next steps you want to mention to make more progress on this?
Just, we're all working collectively, sir, to do a better job getting information out on the role these platforms can play, better information on the impacts that they may not realize are being caused to wildlife populations, forging our relationship with other federal agencies, the state fish and game agencies, and in the international arena, and certainly talking to and building partnerships with a lot of the global organizations we work with as well to enlist their support. So we're taking a very positive and proactive step, and we certainly appreciate the legislation today and the ongoing leadership of the committee in highlighting this very disturbing area of interest.
Thank you. Regarding Mr. Nadler's trapping bill, appreciate you highlighting the fact that it does provide flexibility for Fish and Wildlife Service to engage in whatever trapping it needs to carry out bona fide wildlife management, habitat protection goals. The ranking member, Westerman, described scenarios where, beavers perhaps would run roughshod if we weren't able to do this kind of trapping. But I believe you noted correctly that this bill would, if a beaver somehow was threatening habitat or wildlife that you were trying to manage on a national wildlife refuge, this would give you the flexibility to deal with that. Is that correct?
Just a slight amendment, Mr. Chairman. The text currently would allow us to control invasive species such as nutria. We'd like to work with the committee to make sure that it also addresses native species that mimic the behavior of invasive species. For example, muskrats and beavers can be just as problematic for habitat destruction. And we're walking this razor's edge to invest a lot of money in resiliency, fight climate change, and provide habitat for waterfowl and fisheries and nesting birds and others. And a lot of these animals can get in there and really cause a lot of damage and undermine all of the investment we're making that supports hunters, fishers, wildlife watchers. And the goal of the refuge system and the service is always to treat all wildlife in a use the best science and target where we would deploy traps if they are needed to meet our management.
Thank you for that clarification. And lastly, let me just thank you for your support of my bill to actually authorize the coastal program that has been such a success and is so important. This program has been doing good work for many years. I think it's high time that we officially authorized it. So thank you for that. I will yield back and recognize Ranking Member Bentz for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Girton, for your work in appearing here before us today. I was happy to hear that you thought that there needed to be. I thought there might be. I hope there's more than just that simple one change from invasive to include native. It seems to me that from what little I know about this space, many times moving with great alacrity when it comes to setting up means of capturing animals that are damaging sensitive and even endangered species is of the highest importance. You don't have time to fill out 40 forms. You don't have time to go through all kinds of hoops and processes. Am I right, or can you dawdle about and wait while these animals are being destroyed by we'll say invasive species? And by the way, I'm thinking of the situation we have on the Columbia River where we don't use traps for sea lions, but sea lions come in and just harvest and feast on endangered salmon. And I went on watch one time, and it was sickening, to be honest with you. And finally, action is being taken to try to help the fish. So tell me, are the hoops that are and processes that are in this protective of our endangered species, or do we need to change them more than merely adding native species to the list?
Sure. Thank you for your question, Mr. Ranking Member. Currently, under existing legislation and regulations, we have about 226 units of the National Wildlife Refuge System that are currently authorized to conduct trapping where it's appropriate and compatible with the overriding refuge use. During the past year, 2021, only about 100 of them actually saw fit, based on science, to employ trapping as a mechanism, whether it was to control destructive damage to dikes and levees and water control structures, or to protect endangered species, predators like opossums or raccoons getting onto nests for turtles and birds and things like that. Under this current protocol that we're operating under, we work closely with our partner state fish and game agencies. These animals do not recognize the boundary of the National Wildlife Refuge System. We always use science. We always use humane practices. And then text of this legislation as currently written would constrain us from that flexibility on some of these points. The sponsor has revisited a couple of times, and we really appreciate the way the new text would allow us to control invasive species. We want to talk about other animals that are native to the landscape, such as muskrats. There are some concerns about the cost effectiveness of potentially implementing it. And then we would recommend some better definitional guidance on what an invasive species was, in line with a lot of the other documents in the administration. Would pick up a lot of these native species as well. And so we're very willing to work with committee leadership on this legislation with an overall policy objective of humane treatment for wildlife. Balance that against our management needs on the National Wildlife Refuge System.
And it seems to me that your current process, I think you were just summarizing it, already involves kind of a case-by-case decision, and you consider biological soundness and economic feasibility and effects on other programs. You're already doing this. So why do we need to add another 3 or 4 layer? I shouldn't say 3 or 4 layers. Why do we need to add more to what you're already doing? Seems like you're already exercising incredible care. And again, I'm just reminded of how rapidly, generally, you should move if you're going to protect these sensitive endangered species that we're all interested in preserving. So I'm just asking, what does this add other than more delay and more time when it comes to trying to protect that which we're trying to preserve?
Sure. Mr. Ranking Member, we believe the current legislation and regulatory authorities we have give us that nimbleness, that flexibility right now. I think the sponsor is charging the service to try and look at more humane methods of doing that, and we want to support of that as well. But I think the text of the legislation as it's currently written would add some more procedural things we'd have to go through, and might inadvertently not give us some of that management flexibility we need when we're dealing with some of these species like the nutria.
And thank you, and thank you, Mr. Gardner. That I really do appreciate your willingness to go to battle on this. And Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the hearing record a letter from the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation regarding these issues.
Without objection.
And I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Benz. The chair now recognizes Representative Dingell for 5 minutes. Representative Dingell, you are muted, I believe. Are you ready to go? Is Mr. Soto with us? All right. Mr. Tonko, you look ready to roll here. Can I recognize you for questions?
You most certainly can, Mr. Chair. Mr. Gurdon, welcome and thank you for the support of my legislation for the watershed. Deputy Director, as you know, the Fish and Wildlife Service oversees several watershed conservation programs around the country that serve as models for my New York, New Jersey Watershed Protection Act. Can you speak about how the service has successfully facilitated locally driven restoration efforts in these watersheds and leverage state, local, and private dollars, please?
Thank you for your question, Congressman. We're firm believers in the idea of collaborative landscape scale approaches to conservation, and your proposed legislation for New York, New Jersey Watershed Protection Act would follow a long successful model that we've employed similarly in the Delaware River Basin, for example, and some of the big watersheds out west as well. We've seen a lot of work pulling together state agency partners, private landowners, school districts, private sector, and others, developing a shared vision for landscape conservation. This model has worked very well. And within this geography, we have 3 existing national wildlife refuges and 2 very exciting urban wildlife refuge partnerships in Elizabeth, New Jersey and Yonkers, New York, that can be anchors to help bring in this community support. And then have program delivery programs like Partners for Fish and Wildlife, Fish Passage, our refuge program, the coastal program that will be talked about here today, and others that can provide federal funding to be matched within the watershed. But this collaborative, non-regulatory approach, it seems to be a very good solution to bring disparate opinions together in a geography and work toward a common goal of restoration and sportsmen's access and tackling the climate crisis and resiliency and things like that.
Excellent. Through years of administering these watershed programs, how has the service centered justice and equity in its work, specifically to make certain that low-income, rural, and minority populations and communities experiencing environmental injustice receive the support they need?
Sure. This is also a huge focus for the Biden administration. We have very formal guidance to the Justice 40 initiative to try and do a better job of aligning 40% of our program delivery toward underserved communities. We've embraced this mission, but I think historically have always embraced that because it aligns very well with what we're trying to do. We're unique in the federal agencies in that our mission statement tells us to work with others first and foremost. And so we're strong supporters and believers in engaging communities, getting voices at the table, and then we can bring some cool programs and some very exciting programs to help them fulfill their community development objectives, get kids outdoors, support school districts, and be a magnet to bring in match dollars for habitat restoration, fish passage, wildlife watching opportunities, butterfly and monarch conservation, and a real lightning rod to set the table and engage the surrounding communities in a shared vision.
Thank you. It's been my intent to weave these lessons learned and best practices into my New York, New Jersey Watershed Protection Act so that we can build on the success of existing programs and get this program right from the start. Regional watershed programs in the Delaware River Basin and elsewhere have been effective and popular. How do you see this as being a replicable model that the service can apply to more watersheds in need, such as the New York, New Jersey watershed?
Sure. The Delaware Basin is a long-running program, as is the Chesapeake Bay Restoration Program, a little bit longer in duration there. They've both been a very successful model in bringing in these voices, these interests to the table to talk about what we want the watershed, the landscape to look like 20, 50 years from now. They're a good way to talk about shared priorities and bringing limited funding to bear where it can make the most benefit for conservation as well. And we've had a lot of experience in our Northeast region of late, particularly with some of the Hurricane Sandy resiliency projects and others, to work with all the collaborators on the landscape on habitat restoration. And so we see this as building on that successful model in other important watersheds nationwide.
Thank you. And lastly, in your testimony, you mentioned some of the service's ongoing efforts in or near our watershed, which target specific needs or localities. How would this legislation to establish a basin-wide conservation strategy enhance the service's ongoing efforts in the region to serve additional needs?
Congressman, it would knit together our effort in both the New York, New Jersey estuary there, up along the Hudson River into southwest Vermont, along the Mohawk Valley there, bringing in the headwater areas as well. It can link up fish passage for key species for us. It can link up hunting opportunities. It can link up environmental education opportunities. And I think it can serve as a blueprint to forge a long-term vision for where we want to invest limited dollars for the most important habitat, for access, for wildlife needs, and for community engagement and education as well.
The
Thank you
gentleman,
very much. Thank you for your
time
leadership.
expired.
I yield
Thank
back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Tonko.
Thank
The
you.
chair now recognizes the Dean of the House, Don Young of Alaska. Something tells me Mr. Young might have some strong opinions on one of the bills on our agenda today, so I will brace for impact and recognize Mr. Young for 5 minutes.
No, Mr. Chairman, I thank you. Justice is on my side. This is not a new battle. I am very disappointed in those that sponsored Mr. Nadler's bill. I don't think they understand what the use of trapping does for the management of other species and the effect upon my people in the state of Alaska. Under the Obama administration, and Mr. Gooden, you can answer this, Dan Ash, he expressed concern that the bill appeared to, quote, conflict with Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, ANELCA, by not exempting subsistence use from the prohibitions of trapping, unquote. The bill seemingly makes no ANELCA exemptions. Is that correct?
Yes, thank you for your question, Congressman Young. Yes, our read of the text of the legislation as it's currently written, it's in conflict with ANILCA, and it would not allow Alaskan Natives access onto the refuge system for subsistence trapping.
Well, I thank you for that. And I listened to this presentation. Everybody, I'm one of the only trappers in this old Congress. I mean, I could ask most of those people, 54 sponsored the bill, they don't know a trap from a snap. And I know what is utilized and how we utilize it economically and for control of other species. You mentioned beavers, muskrat, nutrients, all the rest of them. These animals must be controlled. The only way you're going to do it, by the way, is trapping. Is it painful? Can be. Is it inhumane? Maybe. But it's a tool. And have this bill introduced, Mr. Chairman, the best thing you can do with this bill is bury it, because it is not acceptable. It is filled with lawsuits, and the state of Alaska is doing a pretty good job right now with the Fish and Wildlife managing the practice of trapping. And I will say respectfully, we don't have as many trappers. When I was doing this, we had a lot of them. And we don't have as many now. Life is too easy. But we do need it to manage. And this bill is offensive to me. And I do compliment you, Mr. Goodman, in your presentation, because if it was to go somewhere, Mr. Chairman, I want to exempt the state of Alaska, period. Because we have such an entwined Alaska Native operation on these lands that were not refuges before they lived there, now are declared refuges managed by Fish and Wildlife. This bill was adopted with all the flexibility you have in there. The person on that land could be susceptible to an arrest, and that's not acceptable to me. So anyway, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Gooden, thank you for your work. Keep it up. This is something I'm quite interested in. I'm a conservationist, not a preservationist. But we should utilize all our tools to make management of fish and wildlife, with trafficking and everything else, make it right. And so I'm here, but stick out of my state, leaving me alone. Those that sponsor this bill, this is something I don't like. So thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Young. The chair now recognizes Mr. Soto for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for bringing forth this great bipartisan hearing with key bills related to coastal protection, as well as watersheds protection, making sure we're combating online wildlife trafficking. So appreciate your efforts on all this. Mr. Girton, first of all, we appreciate working with the Department of Interior. We have quite the manatee issue in Florida right now, as you are no doubt aware, and we've gotten to talk about this issue before. We appreciate the waiver to allow for some organized feeding by the state and federal agencies of manatees, which is helping out a little bit. They're not responding as quickly as we'd like. And of course, there's the long-term issue of making sure to restore the seagrass. So it'd be great to get an update from you on how those manatee efforts you believe are going, and how we could help with improving the seagrass long-term, their major food supply.
Well, thank you for your questions, Congressman, and thank you for your leadership on this issue as well. This is a huge priority for the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Department of the Interior. And as you know, the record loss of manatees last year was probably twice what it would be in a historic year, mostly from this unusual mortality event, the cold weather there. We learned a lot last year. It was a very unfortunate experience for everyone involved. And we've been working very closely with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, our private sector partners, and our big and powerful and wonderful network of volunteers as well, to try and get ahead of the situation this year. The first priority is to maximize overwinter survivorship. And so we're trying to get in there very quickly if we need to for rescue and rehabilitation of stranded animals weakened from lack of food and forage. We've got about 90 animals already have been rescued and are safe in rehab, being brought back to good health so they can be released back into the wild. Second priority is making sure that they remain in good enough condition to overwinter on their own. And so we've been blessed a little bit. The weather hasn't been as cold the last couple of weeks as we were originally worried about. And we've tried some supplemental feeding, putting lettuce in these floating tanks and other things like that. But looks like it's turning for the worse weather-wise, and we're seeing a decrease in temperature starting today and over this coming weekend. In Florida Power and Light, we understand just today turned on one of the heaters and manatees are moving in, concentrating, and they're responding to the supplemental feeding where the initial reports. I talked to our incident command team late yesterday, get the latest from them. They were cautiously optimistic on moving forward on that front. As you alluded, this is largely caused by a water quality issue that all of the conservation partners are working on a long-term solution there. But, we're all in. We've dedicated base funding. We've carved out a great relationship, operational level with the leadership in Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Our volunteers are helping out. And even as we're speaking, we have folks looking for additional opportunity. Holding tanks, put some of these animals in. I understand a couple were just brought into an aquarium up in Ohio. Other states are reaching out and helping us out. So we'll do the best we can to get through this year while we continue to work on long-term solutions for their viability and keeping them the great natural resource and beloved animal they are in Florida.
And thank you, Mr. Gerten, for that update. We know with the bipartisan infrastructure framework passed into law, and we thank the Biden administration for $1.1 billion commitment to the Everglades yesterday. We definitely need strong consideration for the Indian River Lagoon and the Kissimmee River and some of these other areas for potential future water quality grants. We know that will help bring back the seagrass. We also appreciate Interior support of potentially removing the Ocklawaha Dam. That could create a whole network of new habitat for the manatees and allow several magnitude 1 springs to be accessible to our constituents. So I know we're seeing some bipartisan efforts in the state legislature, so we encourage you all to continue to work with them. Our office will as well. These are all opportunities, both short-term and long-term, to save the manatees, knowing how critical and an iconic species this is for Florida. And so thank you for that. And Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Florida. Mr. Whitman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
There we go. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Listen, I'd like to thank you and the ranking member for bringing these bills up to be heard today. I'd like to speak specifically about the bill that's jointly co-sponsored with Representative Sarbanes, Representative Scott, and myself, the Chesapeake Bay Science, Education, and Ecosystem Enhancement Act, better known as the Chesapeake Bay Sea Act. Incredibly important for not only the Chesapeake Bay and for the states bordering the Chesapeake Bay, but for the nation. As you know, the Chesapeake Bay is a national treasure, incredibly important ecologically, one of the most diverse ecosystems on the face of the earth, not just the bay itself, but all the tributaries there. And I've worked professionally for years as a scientist working on Chesapeake Bay issues involving seafood and the health of the bay related to potential pollution sources. So I've gotten to work hands-on in the Bay watershed for a number of years. It's an incredible ecosystem. This bill reauthorizes the Chesapeake Bay Office of NOAA. And Mr. Chairman, this is indeed a place where there's a federal role. You can make an argument about state programs and the delineation between state environmental programs and federal environmental programs. But this one is where there is a clear need for the reauthorization of Chesapeake Bay Office. The reason being is that the Bay covers multiple states, 6 states to be exact. And we all know that if we don't do things in unison to make sure that water quality controls, whether it's point or non-point source, are done uniformly throughout the Bay watershed, then the impacts indeed affect everyone. I would argue disproportionately affect those states that are down the watershed. Virginia being way down the watershed, unfortunately suffers the impacts of what happens up the watershed. For me, I live it. I worked growing up on the Chesapeake Bay. My son is a commercial waterman on the Chesapeake Bay. I hear from him almost on a daily basis about the things that he sees and experiences on the bay, whether it's crabs, which he harvests, whether it's oysters, which he harvests, or finfish. So all those things are incredibly important for us to make sure that we are coordinating the efforts in putting in place the proper controls for non-point source pollution and for point source pollution, and make sure that there's a coordinating effect to make sure the playing field is level. Everybody needs to be doing equal work in not only conserving the bay, but also cleaning up the bay. We have a ways to go. The Chesapeake Bay at one time was the most productive water body on the face of the earth. Now, listen, I understand with 18 million people in that watershed, we're not going to get back to that point where it was when Captain John Smith came over. But I do believe this. I believe we can get the bay back to where it was in the middle portion of the 1900s. And that is still an incredibly productive water body. The way we do that is through bills just like this, through the Chesapeake Bay Sea Act, to make sure we're coordinating with states, with environmental requirements in states, with federal Clean Water Act requirements, with the NOAA program office, to make sure that those things are happening in unison. So I'm really happy to see this bill, which would reauthorize the Chesapeake Bay office, reauthorize those incredibly important elements of the program, especially the education and training programs, not only for students of a young age in the Bay watershed, but across the nation, to understand how incredibly important the Bay is. And it is indeed an economic engine for the states within the watershed. So we want to make sure we're doing all of those different things. So again, I want to thank my colleagues, Representative John Sarbanes from Maryland, Representative Bobby Scott from Virginia, as we work to make sure this bill gets signed into law. And Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you providing the opportunity today for this bill to receive a hearing and for folks to understand how incredibly important this piece of legislation is. I would argue not just to the region, to the Middle Atlantic region, but to our nation. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Whitman. Appreciate that. Congresswoman Dingell, if you are ready to go, I'd like to recognize you. I think she may not be hearing me right now. So I'm going to ask if Mr. Fulcher is with us, because I believe he is ready to go. Mr. Fulcher? All right. Well, since I can't seem to reach our final two members who were going to ask questions, we were going to thank you then, Mr. Gurton, for your testimony. Appreciate it very much. And we're going to move on to our next panel. Again, I'll remind this next panel, which is non-administration witnesses, that they are encouraged to participate in our witness diversity survey created by the Congressional Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Witnesses can refer to their hearing invitation materials for more information on that. I would also remind the witnesses for this upcoming panel to please mute yourself when you're not speaking, and please unmute when I recognize you. I will recognize all of the witnesses before we bring it back to the members for questions. So for our first panel, we'll hear first from Ms. Kira Davis, Program Director for Conservation Resource Alliance. The chair now recognizes Ms. Davis for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Ani Buju Makwanandodam, Kira Davis Nadishnakas. Hello, I'm Bear Clan and my name is Kira Davis. I introduce myself in Anishinaabe-Moan, the language of the Odawa. I'm a tribal citizen with Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians, and also the Program Director for Conservation Resource Alliance, a wildlife and river restoration nonprofit organization with over 50 years of boots on the ground conservation success. Both Grand Traverse Band and Conservation Resource Alliance's service area resides on the ancestral and current lands of the three fire tribes, the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi, encompassing over 700 miles of rivers, 5,000 miles of diverse tributaries and forests throughout 4 million acres of Northwest Michigan. I'm here to support the authorization of H.R. 4092 and reauthorization of H.R. 5973. I've witnessed the impact of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Great Lakes Fish and Wildlife Act and fully support the authorization of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Coastal Program. These two programs are vital to the Great Lakes region, as both recognize the Great Lakes ecosystem as a whole and acknowledge the vital interfaces between land and water. The Great Lakes region, especially Northwest Michigan, are economically dependent on our tourism. In 2020 alone, 106 million people visited Michigan, spending over $18.8 billion, with over 14% produced through recreational opportunities. The value of H.R. 4092 and H.R. 5973 compared to other federal programs is the recognition and support provided to the vital zones working as a conduit between land and water. These zones, such as wetlands, coastlines, riparian corridors, and stream embankments, can be overlooked, even though these sensitive corridors are where most wildlife, aquatic life, and other indicator species thrive. In my culture and by science standards, all is connected. And without addressing impacts to these conduits, we are only creating short-term solutions to protect the natural system without considering the generations to come. In over a decade, CRA and partners have received over $4.6 million as a recipient to the Great Lakes Fish and Wildlife Restoration Act. These grants alone have leveraged a minimum of $2.1 million in non-federal match. In this period of time, 500 miles of river habitat have been improved, 10,000 linear feet of river have been improved through vegetation practices and in-stream wood cover. 760 miles of river have been reconnected, and over 2,000 acres of wetlands and uplands have been restored, all while preventing 4,000 tons of sediment from entering our waterways. These corridors are habitat for diverse communities of federally endangered species, such as the Hungerford's prowling water beetle, the Michigan monkey flower, and the lake sturgeon. It's culturally significant to the Odawa Nation. Michigan's coastlines provide habitat to 2 of the 4 sacred Odawa medicines, as well as a host of cultural significant medicinal plants and a diverse and substantial number of federally endangered species. These coastlines work as buffers between land and water, and if protected and taken care of, are vital to reduction in flooding, climate change resilience, and Great Lakes quality overall. Emerging issues such as increased algal blooms and invasive species, warmer temperatures, high water levels, and less ice cover has made Michigan coastlines the first line of defense to these issues. The opportunity for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to lead coastline conservation efforts in science is now. This authorization could expand the relations with sovereign nations, local communities, and the public by recognizing the importance of these pristine pockets of protection we call Michigan's coastline. Miigwech, thank you to the members of Water Oceans Wildlife Subcommittee to submit oral and written testimony to support the authorization of HR 4092 and the reauthorization of HR 5973. Please consider the current success of the Great Lakes Fish and Wildlife Act described in this testimony as support to reauthorize and as an example of success, leadership, and partnership. Please also consider the vital need for authorization of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Coastal Program to defend our front line to the catastrophic weather events and future resilience for generations to come. Thank you, and I yield back, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. Davis. The chair will now hear from Dr. Allison Colden, the Maryland Senior Fisheries Scientist for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. Dr. Colden, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, and members of the subcommittee. Again, my name is Allison Colden, Maryland Senior Fisheries Scientist with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, or CBF. On behalf of CBF and our more than 300,000 members, thank you for inviting me to testify today in support of HR 3540, the Chesapeake Bay Science, Education, and Ecosystem Enhancement Act, or SEACT, and HR 4092, the Coastal Habitat Conservation Act. For more than half a century, CBF has led a landmark effort to save the Chesapeake Bay, a national treasure on which more than 18 million Americans and 3,600 species depend. Over that time, we have made great strides to save the bay, but our progress continues to be threatened by weakened regulatory programs, lack of funding, pollution, habitat loss, and climate change. Thus, the reauthorization of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Chesapeake Bay Office, or NCBO, and the work of the Fish and Wildlife Service's Coastal Program could not come at a more critical time for the Chesapeake Bay watershed. HR 3540, the SEACT, would reauthorize NCBO and strengthen their ability to drive research and restoration to support oyster, blue crab, striped bass, and other ecologically and economically valuable fisheries. It would also authorize the Bay Watershed Education and Training, or BWET program, which offers students and teachers the opportunity to learn about the value and wonder of the Chesapeake Bay firsthand. Through research, technical assistance, coordination, and on-the-ground restoration, NCBO provides critical leadership for improving the Chesapeake Bay ecosystem, stewarding our fisheries, and ensuring coastal communities that depend on it are resilient for years to come. For example, NCBO is one of the key agencies implementing large-scale oyster restoration in the Chesapeake Bay. developing restoration plans, coordinating implementation, and assessing completed projects. Through their leadership, oyster restoration efforts in the Chesapeake Bay have become a global model for large-scale oyster restoration. And without their technical and financial support, projects of this scale, complexity, and level of success would simply not be possible. As the federal lead for K-12 education in the Chesapeake Bay region, NCBO provides resources and funding necessary to implement the BWET program, educating more than 700,000 students and 25,000 teachers in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, with high-quality, meaningful watershed educational experiences. Over the past 20 years, NOAA has awarded more than $110 million to 874 BWET projects nationwide and $46 million for BWET projects in the Chesapeake Bay. The SEA Act would provide the necessary financial stability to NOAA Chesapeake Bay office for fiscal years 22 through 25 to ramp up priority programs, environmental education efforts, and to implement its strategic plan. NCBO needs reassurances that it will have consistent and sufficient funding. Next, H.R. 4092, the Coastal Habitat Conservation Act, would authorize the Fish and Wildlife Services Coastal Program. Since 1985, the Coastal Program has worked with over 6,400 partners to protect over 2.1 million acres of habitat and restore over 550,000 acres of habitat and 2,600 miles of stream. These efforts have helped delist or downlist 20 federally listed threatened or endangered species. For every $1 of coastal program funds spent, more than $8 in partner contributions are leveraged. One of the many coastal program success stories is the Delmarva fox squirrel, which was listed as endangered after dropping to less than 10% of its historical abundance. The coastal program partnered with private landowners in the state of Maryland to conserve more than 442 acres of habitat and restore Atlantic white cedar wetlands, leading to the fox squirrel's removal from the endangered species list in 2015. H.R. 4092 provides a steady increase in funding to the program, starting at $20 million in FY22 to $25 million in FY26. As coastal communities continue to battle climate change, increased development, and pollution, it is imperative that the technical and financial assistance provided by the coastal program be enhanced. The added economic and environmental benefit received from the conservation and restoration of the Chesapeake Bay and other coastal ecosystems cannot be overstated. The increased funding and financial security provided by these bills to two critical federal agency partners is key to their continued success and to the recovery of the Chesapeake Bay. Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, members of the subcommittee, thank you again for the opportunity to testify in support of these bills. I look forward to your questions. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Dr. Colden. We will next hear from Mr. Andy Bicking, Director of Government Relations and Public Policy for Scenic Hudson. Mr. Bicking, welcome. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today in enthusiastic support of H.R. 4677, the New York, New Jersey Watershed Protection Act, and H.R. 4092, the Coastal Habitat Conservation Act. I am Andy Bicking, Director of Government Relations and Public Policy for Scenic Hudson, the Hudson Valley's oldest and largest regional environmental nonprofit organization. Through regional ecosystem economies, our Hudson River Valley is inextricably linked to the greater New York, New Jersey harbor watershed, which includes the Hudson, Mohawk, Raritan, Passaic, Hackensack, and Bronx rivers, one of America's most iconic landscapes. Home to over 15 million people, it is one of the most densely populated, developed, and diverse regions of our country. Millions visit it each year and support a multi-billion-dollar recreation and tourism industry. Water-based transportation has also been a major economic engine, delivering goods and services to the nation since its founding. The lands and waters we share provide habitat for many species, including the endangered Atlantic sturgeon, and support fisheries up and down the entire Atlantic coast. Millions rely on this watershed for drinking water that is filtered by our forests and open spaces, and the Hudson River itself serves as the backup drinking water supply for our nation's largest city, New York City. For thousands of years before today, native people used these waterways and thrived on its bounty of oysters, waterfowl, fish, and game. They remain vital participants in the new economy, contributing historic knowledge that guides policymaking and conservation efforts to this day. Human activities, including channelizing our waterways and hardening our shores, have been instrumental to the development of our nation's interests, yet have also jeopardized the health of fish and wildlife habitats, diminished access to natural green spaces, and increased impacts from flooding. At the same time, thanks to the hard work of scientists, local and state government, and advocates, many of our waterways are far cleaner today than they were 50 years ago. Now, our communities embrace their waterfronts, pursuing environmental and economic benefits. The states of New York and New Jersey, local governments, non-for-profit organizations, businesses have all worked together to develop publicly supported plans to address this dynamic. In my role on the advisory board to New York State's Hudson River Estuary Program, I have seen the impact of this collaboration could have with the federal government. 56 groups support this legislation and are eager to bring the federal government in as a partner to do the work. If you'd indulge me in a personal story about the power of these waters, my teenage daughter, along with other youth, participates in a community citizen science study about the migration of American eels in Hudson. She tells me, as she has maintained since she has been 9, that these mysterious animals are cuter than kittens. So if your curiosity is piqued, you might enjoy the CBS TV broadcast on Hudson River eel migration that aired this past weekend. But big picture, through this legislation, we have a wonderful opportunity to advance many meaningful initiatives, leverage state and local and private funding, and restore our natural resources. Successful, popular programs exist on the Delaware River, Great Lakes, Long Island Sound, Chesapeake, and many other great waters. Our region is inspired and has learned from these programs, yet we also note that we are not supported at the same level. So looking forward, we recognize that the economic diversity of our region, combined with our industrial history, creates a huge need to invest in disadvantaged communities. We are excited that this bill is consistent with President Biden's Justice 40 initiative and that it will ensure urban, rural, and suburban communities lacking in environmental justice will receive adequate support and assistance. In conclusion, the New York-New Jersey region knows deeply that environmental restoration and addressing equity are not luxuries. They are necessary to securing the public safety, protecting the natural resource drivers of the economy, and uplifting public health. Together, we are eager to get to work and collaborate with the federal government to ensure a healthy future for our watersheds and the people who live, work, and play in our region. As one of the birthplaces of our nation's industrial economy that continues to be a vital natural resource for millions of people, we believe our mighty waters should be considered alongside our nation's other most significant watersheds and receive a similar level of federal support so that the nation can enjoy their benefits for generations to come. I want to personally thank Congressman Tonko for his leadership on this important effort and all the co-sponsors of the legislation. I look forward to working with this committee to move it forward expeditiously. Thank you for this opportunity to submit testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Bicking. Our final witness will be Mr. Batchelor, who's the Executive Secretary of the Northeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. So the chair now recognizes Mr. Batchelor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, and members of the subcommittee. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here this afternoon. My name is Gordon Batchelor. I'm a certified wildlife biologist. I'm also president of the Wildlife Society. Today, though, I'm representing the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. All 50 states are members. Prior to my current position, I was a state wildlife biologist serving as chief of wildlife in New York State out of Albany, right on the Hudson River. Our mission at AFWA is to advocate for the roles, responsibilities, and authorities of our member agencies to manage fish and wildlife as public trust resources for current and future generations. My written testimony includes comments on some of the other bills considered by the subcommittee today, but right now I'll focus on 4716, the Refuge from Cruel Trapping Bill, whose purpose, quote, is to end the use of body gripping traps in the National Wildlife Refuge System, which, by the way, by definition in the proposed statute includes just about every trap. State and federal wildlife agencies, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, use trapping as a modern, responsible, and humane method to manage wildlife. Trapping helps protect endangered species and migratory birds, restores species in decline, and prevents and reduces property damage and controls destructive invasive species. The premise of the bill that, quote, body gripping traps are cruel is fundamentally wrong. It ignores the significant benefits that trapping provides, and it also fails to recognize the significant progress made to improve and identify the best traps. I'll have more on that in a bit. The bill is also inconsistent with existing state authority and the treaty rights of Native American tribes, who have the right to hunt, trap, and gather on reservations and within ceded territory covered under federal treaty. State fish and wildlife agencies exercise the primary statutory authority for management of species within their borders, including those within the refuge system. Absent clear delegation of power from the supremacy, property, or commerce clauses of the U.S. Constitution, states retain the control over wildlife and entrust for the benefit of the people of their states. The bill flies in the face of that principle. The bill would impose an expensive and burdensome process for refuge managers and biologists to follow before applying a management tool that has been proven to be safe, effective, and is regularly practiced by licensed and regulated trappers across the nation. The exemptions in the bill place an additional burden and unnecessary process on understaffed and underfunded refuge system employees. The professionally regulated and scientifically supported trapping that occurs on the National Wildlife Refuge System works. It is fiscally wise in terms of protecting America's infrastructure, managing habitats and species, and provides an opportunity for outdoor activity. Trapping is an important tool used to protect infrastructure, including impoundment dikes, water control structures, highways. An overabundance of beaver, for example, causes flooding, requiring costly emergency repairs. Trapping is carefully managed by the states and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on the refuges, ensuring that only the most safe and effective methods and practices are used in accordance with scientific best principles. Now, I really want to make an important point and underscore this. For over 20 years, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies has led and completed the largest scientific study of trapping ever conducted in the world. Scientific study, as published in peer-reviewed publications, has demonstrated that modern traps are selective and humane. We conducted trap research in over 40 states since 1996. We tested 600 trap types on 23 species of fur bearers. I personally led some of that research in New York State. Our scientific research to ensure that traps are humane applies to all reason animals are captured. This is why wildlife biologists use the same traps for research and science study as used by trappers for harvesting fur. We conducted trap research that included 230,000 trap nights over 21 years, 23 species, and 600 different traps. We caught in that time frame 600,000 trap nights, exactly 0 endangered or threatened species. The catch rate for the desired species was over 90%, and those that were not intended were often released unharmed. Trapper education offered in the states goes forward to inform trappers how to use these best practices. For this reason, we oppose the legislation and we appreciate the opportunity to comment.
Thank you, Mr. Batchelor. That concludes our second panel. We'll bring it back to the members for questions, and I'll begin by recognizing Mr. Tonko of New York for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you again, Mr. Chair, for holding today's hearing, and thank you to the entire panel of witnesses for joining us and sharing your perspectives. I greatly appreciate your dedicated stewardship of our natural, cultural, and historic resources and waterways, and I am especially glad to have Mr. Andy Bicking here to help highlight the New York, New Jersey Watershed Protection Act. And Mr. Bicking, thank you for investing your expertise in the efforts to protect the natural resources and local communities of the Hudson River watershed. Much appreciated. Mr. Bicking, in your testimony, you discussed several major threats to the New York, New Jersey watershed, ranging from rising sea levels and storm surges to water quality and endangered species. What are the effects of these challenges on communities experiencing environmental justice today and in the future as the effects of climate change indeed intensify?
Oh, thank you, Congressman. Sea level rise is a significant issue in our region. Levels have risen in the Hudson River by a foot, a rate greater than the global average. And the best data we have indicates we can expect those levels to continue to rise at a rate of 6 feet or more by the end of this century. In the Hudson Valley alone, this will impact approximately 10,000 households and 19,000 people and 13,000 acres of freshwater tidal wetlands that are critical to protect our community from flooding. New York State alone, as you know, the counties specified in this legislation have filed over 100 state and federal disaster declarations between 2011 and 2019. And just to give you one local example that may be of interest, in the community of Amsterdam, New York, in the Mohawk Valley, 21% of all of the municipality's land, that's 1,500 properties, are routinely flooded, jeopardizing access for first responders and delivery of local services. So this is a serious issue in our region.
Thank you very much. And what are the greatest barriers that local entities face in their efforts to address major environmental threats to the watershed?
As specified in our testimony, our region has really strong local and state plans that have design strategies to address our challenges, but we really lack funding, federal funding as a partner to kind of move many of our projects forward. There's also many issues we contend with that cross state lines and cross watershed lines, and I'm thinking specifically of issues like invasive species, where we have the round goby invasive fish that is eating the eggs of many native fish in the region. Issues like these, in my opinion, do require federal presence to help resolve.
Thank you. And how is your experience different from conservation entities in other watersheds across the country?
We are a very economically and diverse region. I think we can also be understood by our long history of settlement and industrialization, which have brought some unique impacts that have affected us for hundreds of years. As one of the most studied bodies of water in the world, we're required to work cooperatively with many diverse stakeholders from all sorts of different communities. Yet our eyes are always open to new possibilities. And even though, while we have a high degree of confidence in the strategies that we'd like to pursue.
And what do you see as the future of the watershed without enactment of this legislation?
I believe this legislation is really designed to help our communities implement locally driven plans that are protecting their habitats and their local communities from severe storm events. So without that, I would be very concerned that we would continue to see the loss of life as we saw during Hurricane Ida when 43 people died, many flooded out in their own homes, as well as impact on our natural habitats that have been so instrumental as a foundation of our regional economy.
Thank you. And how will this bill help ensure that the watershed continues to be a national treasure and economic engine for current and future generations?
I think specifically of the New York, New Jersey harbor, which alone contributes $8.5 billion in federal, state, and local tax revenue annually, and is directly responsible for 629,000 jobs. And I believe that by making these critical investments in natural resources, we can help ensure that this economic activity will continue uninterrupted.
And anything else you would like to share with the committee?
Thank you, Congressman. I think one message that is very clear on my mind is just how much we appreciate and have learned from other federal programs elsewhere in the country. I think specifically of the Delaware River program that has really demonstrated us the need for a holistic regional approach in crafting solutions.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chair. And
Thank
you
you,
again.
gentlemen. Ranking Member Benz, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my question here is to Mr. Batchelor. And Mr. Batchelor, the assertion has been made that the HR 4716 is not an additional or undue burden. Is this correct?
Well, I was a field biologist when I worked in Western New York, and I worked with the National Wildlife Refuge staff out there. The National Wildlife Refuge staff are busy people conducting a lot of work, surveys, inventories, scientific studies. As I read the bill and I'm thinking about my friends in the refuge system implementing the requirements, It's clearly a policy of subtraction of resources that the federal government needs to manage the federal refuges for their intended purpose, which is to manage for migratory waterfowl, species of greatest conservation need, endangered threatened species. So I think it's the wrong direction to go to pile on to their workload in a kind of bureaucratic process that really provides no added value. So I think this legislation would clearly be a subtraction to the resources available for the federal government to manage the refuge system.
The underlying thought I think that you're sharing is that whatever is being done now is adequate, and what is proposed by this bill stacks needless effort on top of an already adequate system. So that brings us to perhaps you're describing, for me at least, the current process followed for trapping on a wildlife refuge.
Well, right. So the state and federal government has an outstanding relationship when it comes to managing the federal wildlife refuge system. We work very closely at the field level. We work very closely at the policy executive level too, but ultimately it's on the ground field research. And the states have trapping regulations, which become the high level pattern for what's employed on the federal refuge system. Sometimes the federal refuge system needs to make adjustments because of their intended purpose, but the state regulations are overarching. And we work very closely with our colleagues in the federal government. There are some refuges that have adjoining state wildlife management areas. Sometimes our people are co-located in the same office. And so there's a lot of collaboration that occurs. I do want to make one point that I think needs to be brought forward, and that is it would be a shame if the federal refuge system became a source for problem animals that will go out into the private land that adjoins the federal refuge system or state lands. So this legislation definitely will increase populations of problem animals on the refuge system, and that's going to become a source of problems beyond the refuge system.
And in your opinion, are the traps that are targeted by this bill a threat to wildlife? I think you kind of addressed this on the study that you talked about, but share with me again your thoughts. Is the traps targeted by this bill a threat to wildlife?
230,000 trap nights over 21 years in 42 states, 600 different types of traps. We caught 0 endangered or threatened species. We caught very low numbers of unintended species, and they were generally released unharmed. The same traps used for harvesting animals, killing animals, are also used by wildlife researchers, and that's because when they catch an animal and they're released, they are in good shape for scientific study. When we did coyote research in New York to study their life habits and life cycle, we used the same traps that a trapper would use during the harvesting season. That's because the traps we've studied and have documented through best practices are humane. So the narrative that they're not humane is really not valid today because of the research we've done and the trapper education programs we've employed. And I would like the subcommittee members to just consider the fact that things have changed. And that's because Americans do care about animal welfare. That's clear. And we care about animal welfare. That's why 25 years ago we started this program.
And I really appreciate your taking the time to join us today, and particularly in sharing with us the fact that if this bill were to pass in its current form, what would end up happening is not necessarily helping endangered species and others, but a stacking on of additional procedures and requirements unnecessary, and thus putting endangered species further at risk. Mr. Batchelor, thank you so much for your testimony. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. The chair now recognizes Mr. Sarbanes for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to wave on to the committee and ask a question today. And I wanted to direct that to Dr. Colden of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, which has long been a very key partner in restoring the Bay and helping with various education efforts related to the Bay and the watershed. I wanted to ask about the BWET program, because among its other responsibilities, a key focus of the Chesapeake Bay office is environmental education, of course. And the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Education and Training, or BWET program as we call it, awards educational grants related to bay restoration, and it facilitates environmental education for K through 12 students and related professional development for teachers, which is a very important component as well. I'm the author, I'm proud author of the No Child Left Inside Act, a bill that would bolster students' environmental literacy and encourage young learners to become dedicated environmental stewards. And study after study shows the positive effect of experiential outdoor learning on student development and academic achievement. So BWET is obviously a key partner in that effort. Dr. Colden, can you expand on this idea a little more and describe how BWET benefits students, teachers, and the Bay itself?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, Congressman, and thank you for your leadership and those of all the co-sponsors in bringing forward this bill for this critically important program for the Chesapeake Bay watershed. The BWET program is a critically important program for the environmental literacy of our K through 12 students in the Chesapeake Bay region. As you mentioned, it provides for these meaningful watershed education experiences, which combine classroom learning with outdoor experiential learning, providing students a holistic opportunity to learn about the Chesapeake Bay, its ecosystem, and our watershed, but more importantly, to educate and empower students to be advocates and effectors of change for the future. So we see the BWET program as a critically important investment for the long-term future of the efforts to restore and recover the Chesapeake Bay by educating the next generation of environmental stewards, which will carry that effort forward for generations to come.
Thanks very much. Currently, despite playing an integral role in educating the next generation of Bay stewards, the BWET program is administered by a different office within NOAA, the Office of Education. Authorizing the Chesapeake BWET program as a Bay Office program would provide stability and improve the coordination of its efforts within broader watershed grants. Are there other actions we can take in Congress that could build upon successful environmental literacy initiatives like BWET that can inspire the next generation of environmental stewards?
I think continuing to engage students through outdoor education is a primary goal. As you mentioned, this outdoor education is irreplaceable in its benefit to students in improving their academic achievement and inspiring them for future educational learning opportunities. And with respect to authorizing the BWET program as part of the NOAA Chesapeake Bay office's primary role, we think that's critically important to helping focus the BWET program on the specific environmental issues and concerns that are primary to the Chesapeake Bay cleanup.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to join the hearing today and ask a question. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mr. Sarbanes. The chair now recognizes Mr. Graves for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it, and thanks for having this hearing today. I'm curious, Mr. Batchelor, are you familiar with Nutria?
Yes, sir. I've spent quite a bit of time in southern Louisiana, and I've seen the marshes that have been unfortunately occupied by nutria and the damage they caused.
So I'm sorry. It's like getting a chance to see heaven and then having to go back home. That's unfortunate. But in any case, I'm somewhat concerned on legislation HR 4716 by the banning of traps. We have, by some estimates, millions of nutria, and they're causing a devastating impact, as you've indicated, on our coastal ecosystem, which is exacerbating all of these other factors that are causing land loss. We have a bounty program. In fact, this committee has authorized legislation that helps to fund our bounty program to eliminate these invasive rats that are causing such environmental problems. Traps play a role, and Dr. Colden, I'm sure you deal with this as well. Traps play a role in population control. Do you think that by banning traps do you think that we should just have an exception perhaps for nutria, or how do you suggest we handle that considering the unique problem we have?
Well, let's put things in perspective first. We have the Southwest Louisiana National Wildlife Refuge Complex, 184,000 acres. That's a significant chunk of real estate. And I'm very pleased that the federal government has established a refuge system in these important coastal areas. A general theme today has been the importance of coastal and estuary systems, that's for sure. So this is an issue for all Americans, really. And the integrity of those systems is so important for everything from local economy to the seafood industry to coastal resiliency to adaptation to climate change and so forth. I don't think there's no question about that. So nutria, muskrat, beaver are all species that cause harm to these ecosystems by overabundance. And the only way you can control that overabundance is through trapping. Now, there's an important aspect of this policy that I think the members need to consider. Trappers, the public, are an important component of management on refuge system. To start thinking in terms of government trapping and the process those government trappers would have to go through to implement a program to protect those coastal resources. As I said earlier, that is just a policy of subtraction to the tools that our refuge biologists and our state biologists need to protect these resources. And I've seen the damage nutria and muskrat cause. They literally will open up a marsh, expose it to mud, and in those coastal areas of Louisiana, it is never restored. It's gone. And there is enough problems and pressures on that coastal ecosystem so vital to Americans, let alone the members of your district, that again, this policy should be implemented as one of subtraction in terms of resources and in terms of coastal ecosystem integrity.
And it's not just the coastal ecosystem. They come in and trash the vegetation on levees, which of course contribute to the armoring, which undermines the levee integrity and the protection of communities and ecosystems. So it really is a compounding problem. Dr. Cole, I know that we've shared some of our bounty with Maryland, and that y'all have nutria challenges as well. I didn't know if you had anything to add to the discussion, if you spend much time dealing with nutria population control issues.
Sure. Thank you for the question, Congressman. Yes, nutria were an introduced species in Maryland, and we're having negative impacts on the marshland similar to what Mr. Batchelor has described. And we're subject to eradication efforts with, in part, support from the Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm not sure about the methods that were utilized in terms of those eradication efforts. That's something I'd have to research and get back to you on.
Well, it's my understanding that there's trapping that's done there as well, but I don't want to pretend to be the expert. But Dr. Colden, I appreciate your efforts. I've done work with some of the folks at your organization many years ago, and shared the task of trying to restore a impacted ecosystem. So good luck to you and your efforts. And I want to thank the witnesses, and I'll yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Well, I thank you, Mr. Graves, and I know you always like to stick it to California, and so I guess we have you to thank for the nutria that have made their way to the California Bay Delta as well.
You know, look, we try to share, and we get negative feedback from you. I don't know how to act with you.
All right. I want to thank Mr. Graves and the rest of the members, and thank the panel for their valuable testimony. Members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we'll ask them to respond to those questions in writing under Committee Rule 3.0. Members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing. The record will be held open for 10 more business days to allow for responses. If there's no further business before the subcommittee, seeing none, then without objection, we stand adjourned. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, sir.